tous.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will now call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 41.
Committee of Human Resources, Skills, Social Development, and Status of Persons with Disabilities. Pursuant to the motion adopted on Thursday, February 5th, 2026, the committee is meeting on housing starts in relation to federal programs. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders of the House. Members are appearing virtually by Zoom as well as in the room. Before we begin, I would like to remind all members to please silence your devices as well as refrain from tapping the boom on the mic in front of you for the protection of our translators. As well, you have the option to participate in the official language of your choice. Please select the correct channel using the earpiece in the room. Those appearing virtually, click on the globe icon at the bottom of your surface. Choose the official language of your choice. If there is an interruption in translation, please get my attention. We'll suspend while it is being corrected. As well, please direct all questions through I, the chair, and wait until I recognize you by name before proceeding. Today we have one panel for the full duration of today's meeting. Appearing from Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, Colleen Volk, President Chief Executive Officer, welcome, and Matthew Laberge, Chief Economist and Senior Vice President, Housing Insights. Ms. Volk, you have 5 minutes or less for your opening statement.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to discuss the relationship between housing starts and federal programs in Canada. La SCHL a un point de vue unique et peut-être...
CMHC has a unique and perhaps crucial perspective here. We have a national view. We are operating in all regions of the country, and we are at arm's length from the government. We also have a market intelligence network of analysts in most major markets of the country. We were previously tasked with delivering a selection of federal programs. Today, Build Canada Homes is the lead on creating non-market housing, while we are focused mainly on market housing, which is home to 95% of Canadians. All this being given, the pace of housing starts and the balance of supply are central to our mandate. The latest housing data point to a continued loss of momentum in housing construction, which is broadly in line with CMHC's housing market outlook. While actual starts increased compared to a year ago, this reflects the exceptionally low level of construction activity in the first quarter of last year.
Sales and tightening financial conditions are threatening the future supply of ownership-oriented housing, particularly in Toronto and Vancouver. And building permit data suggests that the high number of rental starts we've seen in most major cities is likely to dry up in the next few years as well. Construction timelines can span years, so a slowdown today sets the stage for future supply constraints. That's a big concern because our analyst is seeing a lot of suppressed demand, with many households waiting on the sidelines for conditions to improve before making a move. We need the pipeline of housing to keep flowing so that it's there when the demand comes back online. CMHC's financing products, such as mortgage loan insurance and the Apartment Construction Loan Program, are helping to keep that pipeline flowing. Last year, our mortgage loan insurance products facilitated the financing of more than 360,000 homes. More than 30% of these were new units. Many developers have told us that without these products, their projects would not have been built. Meanwhile, in 2025, we guaranteed more than $165 billion of mortgage-backed securities and $60 billion of Canada mortgage bonds. These support continued mortgage lending so that Canadians can buy homes and home builders can build them. With Build Canada Homes now here to focus on affordable housing, CMHC has the opportunity to focus in this direction, supporting the market side, where the vast majority of building takes place. I'll close by saying that while I know this committee study is specifically looking at housing starts, that's not the only metric we're tracking. Starts measure the extent of current housing construction activity, and for that, they're essential. Until the moment it starts, a project could be abandoned, changed, or delayed. But other metrics are useful to indicate other aspects of the market. For example, the Housing Accelerator Fund, which helps municipalities clear barriers to construction, measures the number of permits issued. This is because municipalities have control over permits. In the fund's first year, local governments who received funding issued 160,000 residential building permits, 22,000 more than expected. Housing permits generally lead starts by between 6 and 15 months, so they give a sense of where we're going, of the mood in the construction sector. In addition to sharing permit numbers, we're releasing new data on the time it takes to move from a building permit to a housing start. Through our Modernizing Housing Data Initiative, CMHC also reports on housing completions for all urban centres and absorptions for centres with more than 50,000 people. This includes data on homes that are occupied upon completion, homes that are unoccupied, and prices for both. And we're sharing clear, comparable information on development charges across 40 municipalities in BC, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec to clarify their impact on housing costs. With all this, we're moving beyond just housing starts to give a fuller picture of the development process. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Ms. Volk. We'll now begin the first 6-minute round with Mr. Aitchison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Volk and Mr. Leberge, for being here. Appreciate it. This is about housing starts. Mercifully, we've actually been talking a little bit more broadly about housing and the health of the housing sector in this study, which is good because a study of housing starts alone would be, I think, pretty simplistic. And you did speak about it a little bit in your opening remarks, but I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on why just quoting housing starts alone doesn't really tell the full picture. What's missing from just a housing starts analysis?
What's missing is sentiment. So housing starts is a leading indicator of completions. So by the time a housing starts measure when the foundation is poured, that's a pretty good indicator that the unit is going to be completed. So there's a high correlation between starts and completions, and housing starts are the earlier indicator of that. But they're not the earliest indicator of sentiment. So in a time like this, when we're sensing, when we're hearing on the ground that sentiment is souring, that's an important time to have an indicator that's a little earlier than that, and that's where we're looking at permits, because permits are they happen earlier in the process. You need your permits months or years before you can start, you actually get to the point of a housing start. So that's a good indication of sentiment, and we're actively looking at increasing our analysis of that.
Thank you for that. Let's go a little bit deeper. Permits is only part of the picture as well, right? I mean, it's entirely possible for a municipality, I know this, I was a mayor, to issue a permit, but then circumstances change and the permit's never executed and the building's never built. It's also completely conceivable. There are jurisdictions like the City of Toronto, for example. They have thousands of units that are approved on the books, ready to go, but they aren't being built. So help me and help the committee understand a little more about the confidence required in the market, how changes in financing, changes in what's going on with with lending rates and stuff can affect that dramatically as well.
Absolutely. So a company can apply for a permit. There's a cost associated, so they usually do with an intent to proceed, but it is a while until they actually get to building. And in that time, a lot of things can happen. Their construction costs can go up, the interest rates can go up, they may face some local opposition. There may be different issues that cause them to actually not get to the point of a housing start. So a permit is an indicator. It's not perfectly correlated with ultimately housing starts, because some of those may get derailed before they actually get to a housing start.
This might be your turn, Mr. Leberge. But does the CMHC have any suggestions for the Canadian housing market, recognizing it's not just one market, it varies across the country? Any suggestions for creating some more stability in the system that would there's peaks and valleys and shocks that happen. Do you have any suggestions for how we create some more stability in that system of starting with intent to completion?
Sure, that's a good question for you.
Sure. What's really important in terms of bringing that stability is actually to have foresight in what's coming down the road. And to have a good foresight, you need to actually map out the full continuum of activity from, permits even before we're working on pre-sales and building intent for rental market all the way up to completion and absorption in the market. Right now, what we have is a pretty good picture from start to absorption. With building permits, working with other agencies like Statistics Canada, we're adding up to that, and we're also, to your earlier point, releasing now the time duration between a permit and a start, which is a very good indication of what's happening between the two. If it gets longer, it's probably because the market is a bit more under strain. Now, what we're trying to that and go even earlier in the process is working with industry and build the industry association to acquire pre-sale data and their rental market building intention equivalent in order to have the earliest point possible to map out not only the mood, but also to provide the information early enough so that the industry can adjust and have smoother cycles.
Okay. We're quickly running out of time on this first round, but I wanted to, if I could, go back to the report you wrote in response to the effort to reduce development charges, which I give myself a little plug here. It's something the Conservatives have been talking about for a long time, and we're starting to see some progress there. But as it relates to your tracking and sort of following the data and making sure we have consistent data, in that report you indicate that that inconsistent and maybe different types of information collection and data collection by individual municipalities makes that more complex. Can you speak a little bit to how you're trying to address that?
Yeah, so when we started to collect the data, which is about at this point last year, we noted that there was a lot of different information reported, different angles to look at the data, and different ways of reporting it across all municipalities. There's no one standard way of doing it, essentially. And so what we've been attempting at doing, we started with 30 municipalities back in December, expanded to 40 a couple of days ago, is to actually format that data in a way that's comparable across all municipalities. And in doing so, what we're doing is we're not only collecting the data, but we're going back to municipalities to make sure that what we're reporting is actually accurate, and we're not releasing until we get this accuracy. And so the data tables we're releasing right now are comparable. They're benchmarkable across municipalities, and our intent is to keep expanding the number of municipalities we're covering and provide more information to the public.
That's excellent. Okay. Thank you. I think I'm out of time.
Monsieur Atkinson. Monsieur Villeneuve, pour assist.
Mr. Villeneuve, for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I would like to thank the witnesses for being with us today. My first question. Now, we have heard different points of view about the best way of defining housing starts. There are different opinions. Could you explain to us what the logic is behind CMHC's approach, and if you can also give us your opinion about other methods of measuring housing starts? Well, in fact, the way in which we measure housing starts is we look at the point in time when the footing is done, because it is at that point in time that we have clear confirmation that there will be a structure going up, that the structure will follow the blueprint, if it's a residential unit, for instance, because in excavation phase there could be revisions and the nature of it can change. And usually, once the foundation is done, you have a significant percentage of the units that will then be completed and delivered to the market. So it is at that point in time that we have certainty that the units will actually end up being constructed, whether it's residential, the number of units, and the sizes. So there are, of course, other measures, other ways of measuring, rather, housing starts. There are companies who track data, who base it around excavation, breaking ground. But excavation permits, it's not something that all municipalities have separately. Municipalities that do, they don't always have the same definition. And when an excavation permit is issued, we don't have the number of units that will go with that. So it is not very accurate, and it's not comparable across municipalities. So what we tried to do in the study that I was referring to when I was answering a previous question, we actually wanted to come up with something that will be comparable, but also to see the progress of a structure along its lifespan, including the point in which we define the excavation, we mark the excavation, and this would hopefully provide comparable data rather than having a bunch of inconsistent or incomparable data points. Now, I will come back to Build Canada Homes. How are you planning to coordinate your efforts with new entities such as Build Canada Homes so that you provide a holistic picture of the housing market and also help accelerate the construction of new housing? While we are already in touch with our colleagues from Build Canada Homes to make sure we have access to data and exchange data, and hopefully we'll have access. But operational data is usually used for operational purposes, and it requires a lot of work to standardize if you want to use it in research, because from one project to another, the data points are not always the same, so they're not homogeneous. You cannot use them directly. That is true for many programs for housing or other government programs. So part of the work is quite intensive. It takes a lot of time and human resources to make sure that what you have is comparable from one project to another, so that you can come up with reports and research outcomes. Well, are you in touch, I'm guessing, with Build Canada Homes? Yes, absolutely. We are in contact. The two organizations were exchanging information, and we're having discussions. It has been a number of months, but we are working on it. Okay, thank you. Now, the CMHC also publishes monthly reports on housing starts. You referred to them briefly. These updates are useful for Canadians. Now, what are the limits of a monthly analysis compared to giving, in terms of giving you an idea of the situation from one year to another? Monthly numbers are very volatile, especially with regard to housing starts. When you look at the annual number, if you look at April to May, May to June, you would need to do some work on the numbers, on that data. But once that is spread across the whole year, it represents a different picture. So there's quite a bit of volatility, and you need a certain level of stability in that data. So for some years, we have been looking at the trends in housing starts. That is a lot more revealing in terms of the general mood and the general situation of the market. Now, from year to year, April 2026 compared to April 2025, where you are compared to the same month in a previous year. Now, when you do that comparison work, there is a basis number that you need to take into account. Now, last year in April, housing starts were relatively low compared to historical data. So it doesn't take such a big number in April 2026 to show an upwards trend. But when you look at the historical trend, that's where you see if there is a real increase. My time is up. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Villeneuve. Ms. Larouche, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank our witnesses, Ms. Volk and Mr. Laberge, for being with us today. Housing, of course, is something people talk about these days. There are, for instance, news articles on renovictions and people worrying about their future. In that sense, in the Granby Express, there was an article that referred to housing again. And yes, some units are being finished and delivered, but is it really what the people in the different communities need? That's another question we could ask. So this past weekend, there were many articles, very interesting articles. Now, my first question, since 2017, how many units of housing that have been delivered can be directly attributed to the federal programs and not programs that would have existed without federal programs? Now, on the precise number, I can come back to you, but to give you a general idea, if you compare by 5-year periods, again, we can give you more precise information, but from 2015 to 2020 and 20 to 2025, in terms of housing starts, we have seen an increase compared to previous periods, but I can come back to the committee with precise numbers. Okay, of course. I will make a note on my end as well, and we can be in touch, Mr. Laberge. We have had many witnesses in previous meetings who have spoken to us about many years between funding and project completion. What would you say is the time delay between the first funding being provided to a project and the first units being occupied? It varies quite a lot from project to project. It depends on market conditions in some cases. As Colleen was explaining, when there's a permit that's issued, between the permit to the housing start, it also varies. It depends on the construction. Some construction projects advance quite fast because the market is ready to absorb. But if the market is slowing down, that's not going to be the case. So there might be a slowdown in terms of the execution or the completion of the construction. It also depends on the size. It takes a lot more time to deliver a big tower, for instance, as a residential tower. About 2 years ago, for instance, the smaller projects, 4 to 8 units, of course, they were going up much faster. Okay. Now, what we hear from people on the ground, and again, there are articles in the press, is there an increased housing demand that you're seeing from senior citizens? Do you have data that shows a connection between rising cost of living and housing challenges among senior citizens? Because, of course, they might need of more affordable housing given the inflation and their fixed income. Well, unfortunately, this isn't a question we looked into specifically, but what we have seen is that there has been an evolution in terms of housing preferences in senior citizens and baby boomers, for instance. So the connection you make between their income and downsizing tendencies doesn't really happen as quickly in other generations. I represent a riding which includes the city of Granby, but rural communities as well. So people have a lot of questions with regard to Build Canada homes. They are trying to see if they will benefit from this new entity. So for you at CMHC, how do you consider the distribution of federal investment? How much goes to rural or semi-rural regions of the country compared to urban centers? My group focuses on market data, and that information is published regularly, but I don't really have an answer for that question. I mean, for more rural communities, Mr. Laberge, that is a concern because they need housing, of course. Now, what CMHC programs are creating the highest number of housing starts per dollar invested. That would be mortgage loan insurance program, because that allows households to have access to a more stable, a more secure mortgage. That, again, allows a higher number of housing starts. Last year, 1/3 of the units that were benefiting from the mortgage loan insurance were new builds. So that contributes through the volume effect to the market activity. Thank you, Ms. Larouche. Ms. Falk for 5 minutes.
Thank you to the witnesses for being here this afternoon. So we've heard from a number of witnesses that there is cautious optimism about Build Canada Homes. And we have also repeatedly heard concerns about unclear targets, unclear funding parameters, and a lack of detail on how it'll operate. So I'm just wondering, from CMHC's perspective, what problem will Build Canada Homes solve that CMHC could not?
Point to the Prime Minister's comments when he launched Build Canada Homes, and what he said is that an organization is the most effective if it has a narrower mandate. And so Build Canada Homes has a very focused mandate, focused on affordable housing, on deeply affordable housing, where
So
CMHC will concentrate on the market housing, which is the lion's share of the market.
Okay, so CMHC wasn't able to assist in that area then when it came to affordable housing?
Active in both. We were very active through the National Housing Strategy. We were active in both, but the Prime Minister's view is that a narrower focus of an organization will be more effective in addressing the issues in that particular population.
So is that then how Build Canada Homes is going to differ from the work that is done at CMHC?
They'll have their focus will be on what we would call non-market housing or deeply affordable housing. That would be their focus. Whereas we'll be supporting primarily the rest of the continuum of the housing spectrum. We will work together, though. We will have a very collaborative relationship because so much housing is mixed. Most of the way housing is built these days, particularly in rentals, is not strictly market or strictly deeply affordable. We have mixed models. And so we will work together on projects, and sometimes our financing tools will be sufficient to support a project, and sometimes they will not be. And so Build Canada Homes will have sort of the contributions, the kind of deeper subsidies that can help some of these projects move forward.
Or Build Canada Homes ensure that projects don't fall through the cracks? Because we know with bureaucracy, there's a lot of just passing the buck and passing it to a different department, or you don't fit in this box that's been outlined, but you don't fit in this box either. So how are the departments going to ensure that, or these bureaucracies ensure that projects aren't falling through the cracks?
So the housing policy is coordinated by HICC, Housing Infrastructure and Communities Canada, and the minister and the department responsible for that will attempt to sort of at a portfolio level coordinate our programs and our offerings. On an individual project level, if it is CMHC's participation in that is more restricted now because we have in the housing program side of the business, the part where the government is asking us to do things on their behalf, we have really our flagship program is ACLP, the Apartment Construction Loan Program. We don't have some of the other affordable housing programs that we used to have. They will be offered by Build Canada Homes. So we may not be able to fill voids, but the intention of creating Build Canada Homes and their model is that they will have flexibilities beyond an individual program. So we had, for example, we had the Affordable Housing Fund, which had a set of rules. We had the Rapid Housing Initiative, which had a set of rules. Build Canada Homes is not being established that way. They're being established with a pool of capital that they can deploy to projects that they feel are worthy. And so there should be more flexibility.
Is worthy. Who's deciding that, and what are the parameters to decide what what is worthy and what isn't.
They've developed an investment policy that has been out now for a little while, and they're probably developing more details that will go around that. But they do have an investment policy that
I think
describes their
that's something
priorities.
that should be taken into account, because when we look at the stress test that was applied when it came to mortgages, the second one, it didn't work for other parts of the country that weren't Montreal, Toronto, or Vancouver. So I think that there has to be this Canada Whole approach to it, and not just what government thinks works in Toronto doesn't apply effectively across the nation. So I just want to make sure that there's a rural lens that's put onto that. One quick follow-up question I have is, so we have these two different bureaucracies. How are builders going to know where they have to go, and how is there going to be an insurance that there isn't going to be delay because they may have gone to the wrong department because they maybe weren't aware?
We're working very closely with Build Canada Homes, so there shouldn't be a delay simply because they went to the wrong door. Like they should be able to, if they come into us and should have gone there, we are talking daily, right?
Wow.
Like there shouldn't be a delay for that.
Because we don't see that sometimes with places like ESDC, right? There's a lot of Canadians that end up having to come to our offices because, everything's siloed. So that's good to hear, I guess, that there is coordination and conversation between Build Canada Homes and CMHC. And hopefully that stays continuing forward.
Thank you, Ms. Falk. That was a key piece of information to get on the floor in the record. Monsieur Joseph, pour 5.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Through you, I will be asking my questions to Ms. Valk. You were saying that there are other indicators that are also important to assess the situation of a market, of the housing market, beyond just housing starts. Could you explain to us what these indicators are that could help us have a better understanding of the global situation?
Certainement.
Of course. Would it be okay if I speak in English? Okay, thank you very much, because my technical vocabulary is quite limited.
Also, the other indicators that we would look at for that would be things like in particular permits. And as Mathieu described, there are different kinds of permits. There are excavation permits, permits earlier in the process. These are important important indicators for us because they gauge the mood earlier in the process. So we can get an idea of what builders' intentions might be next year or the year after. They're an earlier indicator of what's to come. And at this particular point in time, that's a very important distinction. So housing starts, by the time the foundation is being poured, that project has probably been in the works for several years by permitting, advanced permitting, zoning, all of the steps that have to be taken before they actually pour the foundation. There's a lot that's happened. And so housing starts are a good indicator of what will be completed, but right at this moment, they're not necessarily a good indicator of what's going to be completed 3 years from now. So for that, we would look at today's sentiment, which would be, we would see through things like permits, the information that Mathieu is now collecting, and that data is, while not perfectly correlated to ultimate completions, it does give us a good indication of what's on people's minds now and whether the sentiment is increasing or decreasing in terms of how much builders would like to build.
Merci, Madame Vol. Justement, je vais m'adresser à Monsieur Mathieu.
Thank you. A question to Mr. Laberge, through you, Mr. Chair, of course. Now, with the creation of new entities such as Build Canada Homes, how will CMHC coordinate its efforts in order to improve data collection, planning, and the acceleration of residential housing construction? Well, our role is to work in close collaboration with Build Canada Homes so that we exchange information. For instance, we provide information to our Build Canada Homes colleagues so that they can make more informed decisions. We also have discussions when we need access to some information so that we can improve our data when it comes to housing starts and activity in the marketplace. Now, operational data, of course, requires a lot of work to produce and to make it usable for research purposes, because it's not always standardized data. It has a lot of variation compared to survey acquired information or other sources, for instance. So we have had contacts and meetings with our Build Canada Homes colleagues to see what we could do, and we have been working on that. Well, if we take a global look at the housing crisis, we usually tend to focus on single solutions. Could you give us a more global understanding of what could be a solution given the market constraints? Well, if I understand your question correctly, you're asking about our global understanding of the market condition. We have been seeing some resiliency in housing starts in 2026, but when we look at construction permits, there has been a bit of a slowdown for the rest of 2026 and going into 2027. Now, earlier in the process, for the condo market, pre-sale levels have been quite low. So that tells us that we need to be looking at beyond the 2027 timeline, at least for condos. We don't really have equivalent data for single-family homes or other housing types. That is why we are working with the industry to come up with a survey that will be more comprehensive. That's all for me, Mr. Chair. Thank you. 5 minutes and 10 seconds, sir. Ms. LaRouche for 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mike Moffat appeared before this committee. Now, do you have data demonstrating that we need to focus on a certain type of housing to meet families' needs? That's a perfect question. But to be able to answer the question, we need to go back in time. What we are seeing is that the larger units, the missing middle, as we refer to these, are larger units, multiplexes, or townhomes or single-family homes. Now, starting from 2012, we have started seeing multi-unit projects becoming the majority. That used to be condos, and until 2025, that continued to be the case. Since 2025, we have been seeing rental units that have been representing the majority of housing starts. When you look at the number of housing starts of larger sized units, especially in the ownership market, of course, these take the most amount of time to be absorbed. For instance, they will be centrally located. Of course, the land value represents a significant portion of the final cost. Larger the unit, larger the portion of the land value will be. So these are the more expensive units. In urban centers, mathematically speaking, it's harder to justify or make it work. But the further out you go from city centers for the larger units, 3 bedrooms or bigger, it starts to work. Well, I have about 30 seconds left in this round. Last week, we marked the week of handicap for handicapped individuals in Quebec. What percentage of these constructions take their needs into account? Well, I don't have this data as part of the survey that went out. Thank you, Ms. Letters.
For 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. And just before proceeding to my questions, I wanted to provide the committee with a brief notice of motion. I've been hearing a great deal of concern about the unequal treatment of British pensioners in Canada, and I'd like to give a notice of the following motion to be discussed by the committee at a later date. The motion is as follows. The committee report to the House its concern that British state pensioners in Canada are treated differently from state pensioners in many other countries, and call on the Government of Canada and the Government of the UK to work together on fixing the situation, provide equal treatment for British pensioners living in Canada. Okay, having said that, I'll proceed to my questions. Thank you very much for being here. I want to start by asking just a question about the CMHC's independence. I appreciate that you're offering views on various housing policy questions. And I appreciate that you have a role of independent operation, but is it fair to say that in this type of forum, you're not going to directly contradict or oppose government policy? If I ask you if you disagree with or agree with government policy, you probably wouldn't answer that so directly if the true answer was you disagreed. Is that fair to surmise?
Our advice to government in the context of the privilege that the government enjoys with our advice. Right.
So yeah, you provide advice to the government, and you're not here to articulate disagreement with the government, even if the advice you had provided might have been different. Is that fair?
If our advice was provided in confidence, and usually it was, yes.
Yeah, fair enough, and I think that's totally understandable. I just want to understand the context, especially following up on my colleague Ms. Falk's questions on the decision to build Canada Homes, a separate bureaucracy. You identified what the Prime Minister's views were in that regard, but is it also fair to observe that all of the things that are notionally in Build Canada Homes' mandate were in and remain in CMHC's mandate?
CMHC has a very broad enabling legislative mandate. So yes, there are many things we could do within our mandate. We weren't actively doing them all at the time, but yes, we do have a very broad mandate.
Right. So CMHC wasn't doing all of the things it could do. Of course, that's sort of inevitable. But CMHC had within its existing mandate the things that are also within Build Canada Homes' mandate. You identified the fact then that it was the Prime Minister's view that creating an additional bureaucracy alongside CMHC would somehow lead to greater focus. But it is true, based on the legislative mandate, correct, that CMHC could have undertaken those same activities and could have created a focused division for the implementation of those activities. Is that correct?
Our legislative mandate was very broad. Our active mandate was not as broad as some of the things that Build Canada Homes is doing, but our legislative mandate was broad. Right.
So you would have had the capacity, and you continue to have the capacity to do the things that that Build Canada Homes is tasked with doing. You also highlighted that there's a certain when you speak about affordable housing and market housing, of course, there can be some fuzziness in terms of this distinction that everybody is looking to be able to afford a home, and there are some people who would clearly struggle without support. There are some people who clearly are able to support the purchase of a home on their own, but there are many people that would be in the middle and that benefit from policies that support housing affordability, even if they're not benefiting from what we would outright classify as affordable housing. Is that correct?
There is certainly something. There is an area. There are areas in which Build Canada Homes might have a role to play, and we might have a role to play in the same project, if that's what you mean. Yes. Can I just clarify on the we were legally enabled to do those things, but I wouldn't say they were in our active mandate or that we had the immediate capacity to do them. It would have some of the things that Build Canada Homes is going to do would be, they would have required us to gear up to do them as well.
Right, but you had the existing legal mandate to do them, and the government could have made policy decisions around using existing resources to do those things, and they chose not to. You said the Prime Minister's view was that there was a need to create a separate, focused organization. Would it be fair to ask if your view was the same as or different from the Prime Minister's in this regard, or would it be better to avoid asking that question so directly.
I think I heard very clearly what the Prime Minister believes, and I am
Yes.
the Crown Corporation is a creature of the government and has to do what the government would like to do, and that's our role, and that's what we're doing.
Fair enough, ma'am. I appreciate the precision of your answers.
Madame Desrochers pour 5 minutes.
For 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being with us this afternoon, and also thank you very much for all the work that you are doing with your teams. It's really appreciated. Last week, you published new data on the potential impact of the reduction of some fees that apply to housing starts across the country. Now, with all the caveats around the measuring methods, could you give us a bit more information on that study and on that particular measure and what impact it could have? Yes. Well, it's the second cycle of that study that we are doing. With each update, we have new data. We tried to bring new perspectives. We used comparative data. This time, we tried to assess different reduction or elimination scenarios. What we are seeing is that it doesn't have the same impact in every city, but development costs are not the same everywhere. In some places, a significant reduction of these costs has a big impact on project viability. In Toronto or Vancouver, for instance, we're looking at about 10% of 10% more projects that would become viable, and that would translate into a significant increase in activity and housing starts. In Toronto or Vancouver, if development costs were eliminated, that would help cover 1/3 to a half of the housing deficit that we're seeing in these markets. Thank you for the answer.
On housing starts for a minute. So we've had the conversation today. We've had the conversation in previous committee meeting. So if it's not the right measure, why do we continue using it? And is there a plan to transition out of using that measure? Because it's causing a lot of anxiety, I would say. Yeah.
Great measure, actually. So we stand behind the housing starts as a measure. It's not a great measure of sentiment. And so I think what's happening right now is that there are people who are using housing starts as a measure of sentiment. Okay. Nothing to worry about. Housing starts are strong. And that's not exactly the reality. The reality is housing starts are strong now because sentiment was strong a few years ago. So we need, but housing starts is still a really important measure. It's highly correlated to completions, and we have history of data. We have a very important and factual trend line for that for many, many years. But it's just that because of the situation we find ourselves in today, which is very different than we have found ourselves in the decades previous, we have a very particular drop in sentiment. Okay. And that's not been captured there, okay. So we need a different measure for that.
Thank you. We talked a lot. We talked about the link between CMHC and Build Canada Home. Can you maybe give us an example? I'm very familiar with the existing collaboration because I see it every day. But can you give us an example on a project where, like, how did that collaboration look when there's a mixed housing and when there's a program, for example, the ACPL with some of the, I'll let you.
Sure. So this is a hypothetical, but yeah. A proponent would come in with a project for ACLP, our Apartment Construction Loan Program, which does have affordability goals. So in order to get access to the program, the developer has to be committing to, the proponent has to be committing to a certain percentage of affordable rents. And it may work. We may be able to do a deal with them under the ACLP. But with Build Canada Homes assistance, they may be able to get to a deeper level of affordability. So Build Canada Homes could provide some extra subsidies or some other ways to make the deal, more to make the math work better in the deal, in which case they can get more affordability out of the same deal. And so we will partner together. We'll both be involved. We'll have, we're not duplicating. We're not running two sets of back offices or anything.
Okay.
We'll just work together to make that deal happen and provide a better outcome than if CMHC had done it alone, just under the ACLP.
So thank you. Do I still have 1 second? Well, thank you.
Merci, Madame Desrochers. I have Mr. Seaback next for
Great.
5 minutes.
Thank
Mr.
you very
Seaback.
much, Mr. Chair. When you're talking about sentiment, so when you look at sentiment, do you look at other variables like mortgage delinquencies, power of sale, rising household debt, rising HELOC, all of those things? And if you were to look at those things as they sort of stand right now, would you suggest that that sentiment is helpful for people wanting to buy houses, or would this be sort of driving down sentiment?
For something more technical, but I'll give you the high-level answer first,
Sure.
which is that the strongest indicator of sentiment for us in the homeowner market is unemployment. And the more unemployment there is, the less likely people are to want to buy a home.
Right.
But
are these
and
other...
there's a correlation with arrears there as well. But
Yeah.
that would, so in homeowners, that would be the high level, but Mathieu can probably give you a more
Because,
technical answer.
anecdotally, I read that missed payments are up, power of sale and foreclosures are up, and I would guess that's a factor in sentiment that you sort of put into whatever giant computer or AI that you use to calculate sentiment.
Well, there's actually three ways we try to measure sentiment. There's no such thing as a perfect measure,
Sure.
right? So it's all proxies, so to speak. So yes, the variables you mentioned are some that we look at just in terms of their evolution. For example, arrears have been increasing somewhat in some. It's very specific in some centers. Like think about southwestern Ontario, Toronto, and somewhat Vancouver. But it's important to caveat them from where they started, and it was from very low level, for example. And so that's the type of current analysis we do. That's one way. That also feeds, you're right, in the models, which we have a lot of. I won't get into geeky details, but that's another way. But I think the best way to get at the market sentiment we have is through the network of analysts we have on the ground that speaks to developers in every large cities and ask them, what is your business looking like? What are you doing right now? What are we forecasting for the future?
Right.
Yep.
And, I have conversations with builders in my riding, and I get where their sentiment is. But is what's happening with missed payments, increased foreclosures, other things, do you consider that to be driving down sentiment for buying new homes? And is there a comparable time in the Canadian timeline of the last 20 years where the numbers look similar?
That's a good question. There's no great comparison from other times because this is we're coming out of a very specific economic conditions. And so, but back to your point, yes, we do take into account that. One of the things that we need to account for is that arrears or missed payment, all that is actually an outcome of what was decided a while ago. So it's not a market sentiment of building activity, it's a market sentiment of current homeowners, right? That may impact downstream, but it's not current sentiment.
But if it were to impact downstream, right, is that a positive or negative? It seems to me that it's negative.
Well, the overall, it depends which measure you're looking at. If you mention household debt, it's been, elevated in Canada for several years, but we still have had cycles in the housing system. So you have to look at the overall economic conditions. And back to Colin's point, unemployment remains a key driver of what's possible.
Models. Sounds like it would be fascinating to see your models and how they work.
Yeah.
It sounds like it'd be very interesting to see how your models work. So I know I'm going to run out of time quickly, but do you ever look at the impediments to getting houses built on all levels and sort of grade them or rate them? For example, like what I hear often is that it's at the municipal level that we have the most impediments. And, for example, if I take a look at the Globe and Mail just wrote a very interesting article about the Squamish Nation building those buildings near Vancouver. And without the impediment of municipal governments, they were able to have a huge development done in 4 years. Do you look at that, rank that, and measure that against whatever the federal government is doing to try and improve that impediment? And if so, what's your...
I'd be happy to do a run through our models, quite honestly. Like, but on the impediment, so we did a survey or an analysis, I should say, a couple of years ago about municipal land use regulation surveys. We just ran a new analysis on it that was released a couple of weeks ago that shows that an increase of 10% in regulatory burden leads to an increase of 14% in house prices, which, you know, as you can imagine, dampens demand and slows activity on the market. So, and when you look a bit further, yes, the municipal level regulation are amongst, like, when you think about delays to get permits, when red tape, it's part of the broader picture, obviously.
All like
we do.
Interesting exchange, though. Mr. Saini, 4 or 5 minutes.
Thank you, the witnesses. In your opening remarks, you talked about house escalating funds, which was started by the federal government. And later on, a couple of months ago, the federal and provincial government did some deal in Ontario trying to accomplish the same thing. What is the difference between those two, and what is most effective of the two systems?
Effective but differently. So the Housing Accelerator Fund is a program that was brought in several years ago, and essentially what it does is if municipalities are willing to make commitments to change the way they do things to speed up housing, in turn they will get money which they can use to build housing, to expand housing in their municipalities. So they're rewarded. It's a carrot program. You're rewarded if you do things to speed up the pace of housing. And that includes zoning changes to make missing middle developments easier. It includes making the permit application process more quicker. And they're different. They're not cookie cutter agreements. Each municipality made a commitment to very specific things that it could do. And these agreements were negotiated with the federal government. And there was an award, a payment, and that the agreements run over several years. So they make as they make their commitments, they're able to get these rewards, these monetary rewards. And we have seen a number of changes that sped up the housing, and now we're starting to see the actual increase in units that's coming from that program. The first few years were very much around forming, enabling quicker acceleration of the projects themselves. But because building takes a while, you don't actually see the new units until later in the program. We're at the part of the program now where you're starting to see the acceleration of units. So we are seeing some great successes with that program. The deal that was done between the federal government and the Ontario government was specific to development charges, and in exchange, well, in the Housing Accelerator Fund, DCs may have been a part of that agreement. This agreement really takes DCs on. It says for these kinds of reductions in development charges, the federal government will come in and support in a particular way. So it's far more targeted. My understanding, it's something that's offered by HICC, not by CMHC, unlike the Housing Accelerator Fund that we administer. But my understanding of that agreement is that it's much more targeted at DCs in particular.
Thank you. In the economic statement that was done a month ago, there was a $6 million put in to train Red Seal workers, to hire Red Seal workers. What kind of an impact do you think that's going to have long term? And do you think that's the right program?
On the Red Seal workers, and it's not a part of our research ambit, so I'm not sure that we have an opinion on that. Sorry.
Okay. Now, cost development charges are a big thing, because I represent one of the ridings in Vancouver. You hear that the average unit is costing $80,000 to $90,000 in cost development charges. Similar stories are happening in Toronto. Is there a permanent solution whether it's the federal government or the provincial government who should be looking after all those infrastructures? And because this continues to be a bigger problem that I have seen in the last 40, 50 years.
There are many solutions to development charges. It's absolutely true. If the municipality charges less development charges, they will need to find a source of revenue for the infrastructure that their municipality is depending on. So, but there are other ways to get them. We haven't done any research, so we don't have any empirical comment on what would be the best way to do that. But, the municipalities could, what's in their control would be to increase property taxes. That tends to be unpopular at the municipal level. There are also some regions, municipalities issue debt. Sometimes in some countries, the federal government or the state government or provincial government may be involved in that. But we haven't done any empirical research to say which would be the best or the most appropriate for Canada's context.
Okay.
3 seconds. Monsieur.
3 seconds, I'm good.
That good? You good? Okay. Thank you so much for keeping in time. Madame LaRouche, pour deux minutes.
Ms. LaRouche for 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, this probably will be my last time asking questions. I would like to focus on affordability. CMHC considers that a housing unit is affordable but in many markets, we have housing units that remain inaccessible for many families. So do you think that the current definition of affordability really reflects the capacity of households or individuals to pay?
30% of income. If a household spends 30%, more than 30% of their household income on lodging, that's their definition of affordability. That more than 30% is not good. What we find in our programming, though, is that we tend to be more flexible because affordability used to mean something very clear. Today, in today's context, it can mean many different things. It can mean when we used to talk about affordable housing, we used to talk about it in the sense of like social housing, subsidized housing. And now it has come to be, affordability has come to be an issue in middle-income families. So it's a much larger issue now. So depending on the type of market that we're looking at, the type of problem we want to solve, sometimes some flexibility around the definition for programming purposes is good. And I know that on the day that BCH was announced, that was a definition that they said they would be trying to work with.
Oui, parce qu'en ce moment, c'est ça, c'est la fameuse question du 30%.
Well, the 30%, some people end up paying more, of course, and we're seeing that affordability comes up time and again in this committee. So I have 30 seconds left. You have the Canadian Association of Housing Construction Companies that are saying that restrictive policies, development charges, municipalities, rules, increasing cost of material and labor have all contributed to increasing construction costs. So in 10 or 15 seconds, what is the main item responsible for the increasing costs in all this? When you look at the construction costs, yes, there's regulation-related delays. They have their role, but of course, materials are more expensive, and that impacts on a per-unit basis.
Mr. Aitchison for 5.
Very exciting to get a second chance. Thank you. I'll just say this right now. I'm on the record as saying I don't know why they had to create a 4th federal housing agency, but that's not your problem. But one of the things we have talked a bit about around here is this notion of targets. And when the National Housing Strategy was created in 2017, much of that was plopped in the lap of the CMHC, which was really not in the business of delivering programs anymore, even though its creation back in the late 40s was all about building homes. And so what I find interesting, though, is, of course, all the research that the agency does. It's really good research. And among that research, the CMHC has concluded that we need to build between 430 and 480,000 units per year for the next several years to restore some semblance of affordability. Build Canada Homes does not have any targets attached to its mandate. And so I'm wondering if you could, based on the research that you do, 95% of housing in this country is market housing. They're focused on non-market housing. Can you tell us, will they be, here's a question. What target should they be set? What target should be set for Build Canada Homes in terms of achieving part of this overall goal?
I don't think I have a really good answer for it. I would say their target is going to be, well, it'll be up to government to determine a target, but it will be related very strongly to the amount of capital that is put behind it. They're
Hold on a
operating
second, though. I'm sorry to cut you off, Ms. Volk, but
okay.
Related to the capital behind it or related to the need that exists? Shouldn't a target be related to the need that exists? Your target that the CMHC published, based on the number of units that need to be built for the next several years, is based on the need, not how much money you have at your disposal. So should their target not be based on the need that exists?
I understand what you're saying. I would say that if we determined the need, so if there was a quantification for the need, then and the expectation was that they would completely fill that need, then their capital, the amount of capital that they were given by government would have to be sufficient to extinguish that need.
So we don't know the answer to that question.
Right.
We don't know if they got enough capital or how much they, okay. Here's another question then. Have there been discussions between the CMHC, your research department, and the Build Canada Homes folks, and or maybe the Ministry of Housing and Infrastructure, about an analysis of what that target should look like?
I don't know, Matthew, if you've been involved. I'm not sure that we would be privy to those conversations because they would likely be happening between the minister and Build Canada Homes and HICC, the portfolio department. I'm not sure that we would have been
But might they not
involved.
talk to your, I mean, no one does more research on housing in this country than the CMHC, I'm assuming.
Yes.
You strike me as maybe the most ideal organization to talk to about doing the research necessary to come up with an appropriate target for non-market housing in this country. Maybe I'm making you some new work, but...
Sorry.
Yeah, so the challenge here is most of what the research my team does is around market housing. When it gets into the policy evaluation, this is not something we're privy on, or foresight for that matter. So we haven't had discussion around that topic.
Has there been any analysis done by your shop on if 95% of housing in this country is in fact market, that would indicate, based by my simple math that I understand, that 5% is non-market. And if we're missing a certain percentage in market, how much are we missing in non-market? I mean, there must be some analysis that sort of gives us the data for all of these things. I mean, honestly, they've come up with $11 billion as the capitalization for this thing. And I'm a little worried that there's been no analysis done to suggest that that's an appropriate number.
There are really different drivers between market and non-market, and there actually are like in French we say vase communicant. So if you actually increase the supply of non-market, you may give, that's a possible outcome that we haven't researched, but that you may disincent people to go in the market side of things, right? So there's a thin balance. What we did look at, and we have a paper that's public on that, is capacity of building overall for the whole of the country based on the resources that we have in the country right now.
So it's safe to say we need more affordable housing in this country, but would you also agree that we need all homes to be more affordable?
The way we approach it is that we need a diversity of options for all households in Canada. Really, it's because when you think about housing, it's not like isolating housing from the broader context. Eliminate some trade-offs that are possible. I may rather have a bigger home on a bigger lot further away from downtown and commute every day, or I may value having be closer to my work and not having to commute and have a much smaller unit. So those are trade-offs that are really important.
I'm out of time, but I want to talk more about this one. Thank you.
Excuse me, Mr. Aitchison, Madame de Rocher, pour conclure, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Can we just continue a little bit on this? So my question, because we're always talking about the 95 and the 5%, and we know that one of the goal of Build Canada Home, there are some targets. Targets will be established once it's able to become a full Crown corporation after we are able to vote on Bill C-20. Then I'm sure they will bring the targets as part of the departmental plan that they will be putting forward. But can we talk about like the goal of doubling construction of affordable homes and how that is going to help reduce, or will it help reduce the pressure on housing costs for market housing?
So yeah, there are two ways in which additional supply can actually help alleviate affordability issues. The first one is through what we call filtering. Essentially, creating more supply helps also to move up the ladder of housing and free up more affordable units. So really, it's important to bring a diversity of different unit types so people can actually move fluidly from a unit to another and free up more affordable. That's a process that takes some time, but we are seeing some elements of it at the upper end of the rental market. That's usually the initial stage of filtering. It takes several years to fully materialize through the whole continuum of housing, however. The other way is also by providing more supply. It actually helps income to catch up with price growth, because we oftentimes forget that affordability is not just only about the price tag, it's about the income to afford it. And so if you make house prices keep growing at a slower pace than income, or you boost income at a higher pace than house prices, then it catches up and naturally improves affordability over time, which is also a way that additional supply works.
Les données là, que vous avez, est-ce que on s'en va dans?
In the data you have, do you see that we're going in that direction? It might be too early to tell, but we know that rent is coming down, salaries are going up, employment and unemployment numbers are quite stable. Well, certainly the price on the one hand and market conditions that are a bit more relaxed compared to a couple of years ago are in favor of a more fluid market and a slower rise in rent and house prices. There is a bit of a catch-up happening in terms of incomes, and in our research what we have seen is that with the resources we have, there's a bit more capacity to increase housing offer, because we've never had this many people in the last number of years at least working in the housing industry. Over the medium to long term, if that is sustained, that could translate into a lot more housing starts, but of course that would require structural changes, consolidation in the industry, for instance, to make sure that there is enough capital to invest in new technologies. So the use of modern construction methods, could that help? Well, yes, that's one of the things. There are some developers who are using technology to track resources in a more efficient way, to translate into savings about maybe 10% or so, and by doing small changes, because we spoke about regulation. Building information modeling is a technology that's been used in the UK during the pandemic, which then had the impact of reducing the admin burden. So there are a number of measures that can help. But the policy of increasing housing supply is a good idea in general, we would say. Any additional housing is important at this point in time. Affordable market and the missing middle, all of these are important.
Je crois que
I think I will just use my 20 seconds to thank the witnesses for being with us today and for the important work that you are doing. It's indeed very, very important, and it's something we see and hear from people when we get together with developers and people in the housing sector.
I believe it is the will of the committee to adjourn, but before we do, let's remind the committee we'll be meeting on Thursday, same time with same study, homelessness and housing starts, as well as Centennial Flame. So with that, thank you all for attending. Adjourn. Good
job, Bobby.
First time right on.